I'm 83 now. My fingers gnarled around this pen like claws, trying to write down what happened before my memory fails me completely. The nurses here at Sunset Manor think I'm just another old woman scribbling nonsense, but they're wrong. Every word I'm about to tell you is true, even the parts I wish weren't. It was December 15th, 1955. I remember the date because it was exactly 25 years after my mother's death, and I'd spent the morning thinking about her warnings I should have heeded. The wind was howling like a banshee across our Kansas wheat fields, rattling our little farmhouse until I thought the walls might cave in. John had left that morning for Topeka, chasing another construction contract that might keep us afloat through another brutal winter. Our daughter Sarah, barely 2 years old, was finally asleep in her crib after hours of fussing. I was mending John's work shirt by lamplight, trying not to think about the bills stacking up on the kitchen table, or the strange man Mrs. Patterson had seen asking questions about our family in town. That's when I heard the back door splinter. I looked up from my sewing and saw him standing in my kitchen, tall, gaunt, with a jagged white scar running from his ear to the corner of his mouth. His eyes held the same cold hunger I'd learned to fear as a child, but this was different. This was personal. Hello, sister. He said, his voice soft as velvet and twice as dangerous. I'm Thomas Reynolds, and we have some family business to discuss. The name hit me like a physical blow. Reynolds. The same name my dying mother had whispered as a warning 25 years ago. The same name I'd found in that blood-stained newspaper clipping hidden in her tin box, connected to a string of brutal murders across 3 states. I knew in that instant that everything I'd built, my marriage, my home, my precious daughter sleeping in the next room, was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined. The past had finally found me, and it had come wearing the face of violence itself. What I couldn't know then was that this night would force me to become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of things that would haunt me for the next 48 years. The woman who faced Thomas Reynolds that December night would be forever changed by what she had to do to survive. My name is Margaret Elizabeth Morrison, though everyone has always called me Maggie. I was born in 1930 on a failing wheat farm outside Dodge City, Kansas, to a woman who died keeping secrets and a man who wasn't my father, though I wouldn't learn that truth for many years. The Great Depression had Kansas by the throat when I was growing up, and our farm was slowly choking along with everything else. We lived in a 2-room house with walls so thin you could hear a mouse sneeze, surrounded by 30 acres of dust and broken dreams. My mother, Sarah Morrison, was dying of consumption tuberculosis, the doctors called it, though we couldn't afford doctors most of the time. She spent her days in bed, coughing blood into rags she tried to hide from me, growing thinner and more translucent by the month. The man I called Pa Frank Morrison had married my mother when I was 3, though he never let me forget what a burden that made me. He was a bitter, broken man who blamed everyone else for his failures, especially the 8-year-old girl who ate food we couldn't afford and reminded him daily of his inability to provide. "You're nothing but bad luck," he'd slur when the moonshine took him, which was most nights after the crops started failing. "Been nothing but trouble since the day you drew breath. Your ma should have drowned you when you were born." The beatings started small, a slap for spilling water, a shove for being too slow with chores. But as the years passed and our situation grew more desperate, Frank's violence escalated. By the time I was 10, I was sporting fresh bruises more often than not, careful to keep my sleeves pulled down and my mouth shut about what happened behind our closed door. "He doesn't mean it," my mother would whisper after particularly bad nights holding me while I cried. "The drink makes him crazy. He's not a bad man, just lost." But I saw the fear in her eyes when his footsteps approached, heard the way her breathing changed when he raised his voice. She was as terrified as I was, trapped by her illness and our poverty, in a house with a man whose rage grew larger every day. The worst beating came in November 1938 when I was 8. I'd accidentally broken one of our few remaining plates while washing dishes, and Frank exploded like I'd burned down the barn. Clumsy little bitch. He grabbed my arm and twisted until I felt something pop in my shoulder. Can't even trust you to handle a goddamn plate. He threw me against the kitchen table so hard I saw stars, then kicked me in the ribs until I curled up like a pill bug, trying to protect my organs. Frank, please, my mother begged from her bed. She's just a child. She's old enough to learn consequences, he snarled, unbuckling his belt. Old enough to know what happens when you destroy what little we got left. The belt left welts across my back and legs that took weeks to heal. But worse than the physical pain was the look in his eyes, like he enjoyed it, like my suffering somehow eased his own. That night, while Frank snored off his drunk and my mother coughed herself toward unconsciousness, I made my first real plan for escape. I was too young to execute it, but old enough to understand that I needed to start preparing. I began hiding coins I found in Frank's pockets, stealing scraps of food to build my strength, and learning to move silently through our house to avoid triggering his rages. But it was a conversation I overheard between my parents that truly opened my eyes to how deep our troubles ran. He's been asking questions in town, my mother whispered one night, her voice tight with fear. Who? Frank's voice was sharp, suddenly sober. You know who? Thomas Reynolds? Mrs. Patterson said he was at the general store showing people an old photograph, asking if anyone knew a woman named Sarah Holbrook. The silence that followed was thick with tension. I pressed my ear against the thin wall, hardly daring to breathe. That's your maiden name, Frank said finally. I know what my maiden name is. My mother's voice cracked. He knows about her, Frank. Knows about Maggie. How could he know you said you never told anyone? I didn't. But he's been tracking down all the women James knew. Some of them have been hurt, Frank. Bad hurt. Who was James? And why did the name Thomas Reynolds make my mother sound like she was dying all over again? If he comes here, Frank said, and his voice held a kind of cold determination I'd never heard before. You let me handle it. You hear me, Sarah. Don't you say nothing to nobody about nothing. My mother started coughing, then violent spasms that ended the conversation, but I'd heard enough. Someone was hunting us, someone connected to a mysterious man named James, and my parents were scared enough to whisper about it in the dark. I was 8 years old, and I already understood that our little farmhouse sat in the crosshairs of something dangerous that had been building long before I was born. My mother died on a bitter February morning in 1942, when I was 12, and the country had gone to war with half the world. I found her collapsed in the chicken coop, her lips blue with cold, her breathing so shallow I had to put my ear against her chest to hear it. Maggie, she whispered when I helped her back to the house. My tin box, under the loose floorboard, when you're grown. She pressed a small brass key into my palm, her fingers like ice. Promise me you'll wait. Promise you'll be old enough to understand. 3 days later, she was gone. Just stopped breathing in her sleep like her tired body had finally given up the fight. I sat beside her bed for hours, holding her cold hand, wondering what secrets were important enough to hide, until I was old enough to understand. Frank disappeared the night after we buried her in the Dodge City Cemetery. I woke up to find his few belongings gone and a note on the kitchen table. Can't afford to keep you. County'll find you a place. I was 12 years old, alone on a failing farm, with no money and no food, but I felt more relief than fear. Whatever was coming next couldn't be worse than Frank Morrison's fists. The county social worker, Mrs. Patterson, was a stern woman who'd seen too many orphaned children to waste sympathy on one more. You'll go to your mother's relations in Oklahoma, she announced, loading my few possessions into her automobile. Ruth and Earl Henderson run a general store in Bethel. They're good Christian folks who'll give you a home in exchange for honest work. The train ride to Bethel took 6 hours through country that looked like the surface of Mars, red dirt and scrub brush stretching to every horizon. I pressed my face to the window and wondered if I'd ever see green grass again. Ruth and Earl Henderson met me at the depot, their faces set in expressions that might have been kindness or duty. I never figured out which. Earl limped from Great War shrapnel, and Ruth had the pinched look of a woman who'd spent her life swallowing disappointments. "You'll earn your keep," Earl told me on the ride to their house. "No charity in this world, girl. Work hard, keep your complaints to yourself, and we'll get along fine." "She's small for 12, Ruth observed, looking me up and down like livestock. "Hope she's stronger than she looks." That first night alone in the storage room behind their store that would serve as my bedroom, I used my mother's brass key to open her tin box. Inside were photographs I didn't recognize, a letter I couldn't yet read well enough to understand, and a silver locket engraved with initials S.H. and J.R. I held the locket up to my candle's flame, trying to puzzle out its meaning. S.H. had to be Sarah Holbrook, my mother's maiden name. But who was J.R., and why had she hidden this away like buried treasure? The questions would eat at me for years, but that night, I was too exhausted and heartsick to think about anything except survival. I'd lost my mother, my home, and what little security I'd ever known. All I had left were mysterious initials on a silver locket and the growing certainty that my life held secrets I was still too young to bear. But childhood has a way of ending abruptly when circumstances demand it. By morning, I would discover that the Hendersons' version of Christian charity came with a price I wasn't prepared to pay, and that surviving Frank Morrison's violence had only prepared me for new and different kinds of suffering. Earl Henderson believed in the purifying power of hard work and harder discipline. On my first morning in Bethel, he had me loading 50-pound flour sacks while he watched with calculating eyes. "Whop faster," he barked when I struggled with weights meant for grown men. Time is money, girl, and wasted time is stealing from the Lord. I was 12 years old and weighed maybe 75 pounds, but he showed no mercy for my size or inexperience. When I dropped a sack and flour spilled across the storeroom floor, his reaction was swift and brutal. "Clumsy as your mother was foolish," he snarled, unbuckling his leather belt. "She couldn't keep her legs closed or her mouth shut, and look what it got her, a bastard child and an early grave." The words stung worse than the beating that followed. How did he know about my mother's secrets? What had she done that made even distant relatives look at me with contempt? Ruth watched the punishment from the doorway, her face carved from stone. "Scripture says, 'Spare the rod and spoil the child.' Your mother clearly spared too many rods." The belt left welts across my shoulders and back, but Earl was more calculating than Frank Morrison had been. He knew exactly how hard to hit without leaving marks that would show in my school clothes, how to cause maximum pain without doing permanent damage. "You'll work twice as hard tomorrow," he informed me as I struggled to pull my shirt back on. "Waste nothing, break nothing, and maybe you'll earn the privilege of supper." School offered no refuge from the Hendersons' harsh regime. The other children whispered about that charity girl from Kansas and kept their distance. I ate lunch alone, walked home alone, and spent evenings too exhausted to make friends, even if anyone had been willing. "Why doesn't anybody like me?" I asked Ruth one evening after a particularly lonely day. She looked up from her sewing with cold eyes. "Because you're tainted child, born from sin and raised in shame. Decent folks can smell that kind of corruption, and they protect their children from it." "Oh, what sin? What corruption?" "Ask your mother when you see her in the next life," Ruth replied. "Maybe she'll finally tell you the truth about what she was." The months passed in a haze of backbreaking work and casual cruelty. I grew thinner despite eating whatever scraps I could find, and my monthly bleeding stopped entirely, a development that seemed to please Ruth immensely. "At least we won't have to worry about you following your mother's example," she observed with satisfaction. "Can't make the same mistakes without the monthly curse." I didn't understand what she meant then, but her words carried implications that made my skin crawl. What example? What mistakes? Every conversation seemed to dance around secrets that everyone knew except me. The breaking point came in my 13th spring when I caught a respiratory infection that left me bedridden for a week. Instead of rest and medicine, Earl saw my illness as malingering and laziness. "Sick is just another word for weak," he announced, dragging me from bed on my 4th day of fever. "And weak is just another word for worthless." He forced me to work despite burning with fever, loading heavy crates and scrubbing floors while I swayed on my feet. When I collapsed in the storeroom, he kicked me until I got up again. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I'm really sick. I can't." "Can't is not a word we use in this house," Ruth interrupted from the doorway. "Your mother probably babied you, filled your head with excuses and self-pity. We're here to cure you of that weakness." But it wasn't weakness that made me steal that extra bread roll from the kitchen that night, or pocket those few coins from the till over the following weeks. It was calculation. At 13, I finally understood that the Hendersons would work me to death if I let them, and that salvation would have to come from my own efforts. I began planning my escape with the methodical patience Frank Morrison had beaten into me. A penny here, a nickel there, always careful never to take enough to be noticed. I studied the train schedules in discarded newspapers, memorized routes to larger cities, and practiced walking without making noise across creaking floorboards. "You've gotten quiet lately," Earl observed one evening. "Quiet girls are usually planning something they shouldn't." "No, sir," I replied, meeting his eyes with perfect honesty. "Just trying to be better." He stared at me for a long moment, searching for deception. "Better is good. But remember, the Lord sees everything, girl. Every thought, every plan, every secret sin. You can't hide from his judgment." I nodded meekly, but inside I was thinking that if God was watching, he sure was taking his time sending help. Maybe I'd have to save myself after all. By my 14th birthday, I'd accumulated $3.47 enough for a train ticket to Kansas City and maybe a week of cheap meals. More importantly, I'd learned to read well enough to tackle my mother's letter, and what I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about my past. The letter was written in my mother's careful script, dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you are old enough to face hard truths. Frank Morrison was not your father, though I let him believe he was raising another man's child from a previous relationship. Your real father was James Reynolds, a traveling salesman who came through Dodge City in spring 1929. James was handsome and charming, everything Frank was not. We had an affair that lasted 3 weeks while James was working his territory. He promised to return for me to take me away from my failing marriage, but he never did. When I realized I was carrying his child, I was desperate. I couldn't raise a bastard child alone, so I let Frank assume you were from my first marriage. The deception haunted me, Maggie, but James Reynolds was not the gentle man I thought I loved. I learned later that he was running schemes on lonely women across 3 states, seducing them, getting them pregnant, then demanding money to keep their secrets safe. His brother Thomas collected these payments often through violence. If you ever encounter anyone from the Reynolds family, be very careful. Thomas Reynolds is a dangerous man who believes he's owed something by every woman his brother wronged. Inside this box, you'll find evidence of their crimes. I pray you never need it, but if Thomas comes looking for you, you'll understand what you're truly facing. My hands shook as I read those words by candlelight. Everything I'd believed about my origins was a lie. My real father wasn't some tragic figure who'd died young. He was a criminal who'd abandoned his pregnant lover to pursue other victims. And somewhere out there, his brother was hunting down those victims' children, collecting debts he imagined were owed. I dug deeper into the tin box, and found the evidence my mother had mentioned newspaper clippings from Texas and New Mexico describing a series of brutal attacks on women, all connected to a man named Thomas Reynolds. The descriptions were horrifying: broken bones, burned skin. Worse things the newspapers couldn't print in a family publication. Suspect is described as tall and thin, with distinctive scarring along the left jaw from ear to mouth. One article noted, "Extremely dangerous. Citizens should not approach if spotted." The same scarring my mother had lovingly described on my father's face, except this was on his brother, the violent collector of family debts. But it was the last item in the box that truly terrified me, a diary my mother had kept during her final months with entries that made my blood run cold. January 1942. Thomas Reynolds came by the farm today, asking questions about James. I told him I'd never heard the name, but he knows I'm lying. He described things only James would have known, private things about our time together. I think he's been tracking down all of James's women, and now he's found me. February 1942. He returned. This time he wanted to know about children. Asked directly if James had left me with any complications that needed handling. I denied everything but his eyes. There's something wrong with him, something broken and violent. I'm frightened for what might happen to Maggie if he learns the truth. Or March 1942. Found out what handling complications means. Thomas doesn't just collect money from James's victims, he eliminates evidence. The women who can't or won't pay have been found dead, made to look like accidents or suicides. We're not dealing with simple extortion. This is something much worse. The final entry was dated 3 days before my mother's death. I know he's coming back. No, he won't believe my denials forever. I've hidden all the evidence I could gather in this box, hoping someday it might help Maggie understand what she's facing. If Thomas Reynolds comes for her, she needs to know he's not just collecting money, he's eliminating loose ends. He won't stop until everyone connected to James Reynolds is dead. I sat in that storage room surrounded by evidence of a family legacy of violence and crime, finally understanding why my mother had been so frightened in her final months. She hadn't died of consumption alone, she died of terror, knowing that someday her daughter would face the same predator she'd managed to avoid. At 14, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I wasn't going to wait for Thomas Reynolds to find me. I was going to disappear into America's vast interior, change my name, build a new identity, where the sins of James Reynolds couldn't touch me. But first, I had to survive the Hendersons long enough to execute my escape plan. The opportunity came during a late spring thunderstorm that knocked out power throughout Bethel. In the chaos of trying to save merchandise from a leaking roof, I slipped away from the store with my accumulated savings and the few possessions that mattered to me. The train to Kansas City left at midnight, and I was on it with my mother's secrets clutched against my chest and the growing certainty that I was running toward freedom or toward a destiny I couldn't escape. Either way, I was finally taking control of my own story, and that felt like victory enough for a 14-year-old girl who'd been beaten down for most of her life. Kansas City in 1945 was a revelation: buildings that clawed at the sky streets packed with automobiles and more opportunity than I'd ever imagined. But it was also dangerous for a 15-year-old girl with no connections and $8 to her name. I found work at Murphy's Diner near the stockyards, where the owner, Kathleen Murphy, was a tough Irish woman who'd survived her own share of hard times. "You look like you're running from something," she said on my first day, tying an apron around my waist. "I don't care what, long as you show up on time and don't steal from the till." The work was hard but fair: 12-hour shifts, serving coffee and pie to meatpackers, railroad workers, and traveling salesmen. I learned to balance 6 plates on my arms, remember complex orders, and deflect crude comments without losing my tips. It was at Murphy's that I met John Hartley, a quiet man who worked at the armor plant and came in twice weekly for coffee and apple pie. He was different from other customers, polite, respectful, and genuinely interested in conversation rather than conquest. "You're not from Kansas City," he observed one slow Tuesday afternoon. "What gives me away?" "The way you flinch when people raise their voices. And you never talk about your family." He had gentle eyes and calloused hands, and when he smiled, it was like sunrise after a long, dark night. We began talking during his visits, sharing carefully edited versions of our pasts and dreams for the future. "I want to buy a little place in the country someday," John told me. "Raise a family, build something that lasts." That sounds nice," I replied, though the word family still made me nervous. How could I explain that my bloodline carried violence like a genetic curse? We courted for a year before he proposed, offering a simple gold band and promises of faithfulness. I accepted with my whole heart, believing I'd finally escaped the shadows of my past. We married in October 1948 at the courthouse with Kathleen Murphy as witness. I was 18, John was 24, and we both believed love could overcome any obstacle life threw at us. Our first apartment was small but clean, and for 2 years we were genuinely happy. John worked steady shifts while I kept waitressing, both of us saving toward a house and the family we planned to start. But happiness, I learned, was fragile as spun glass. My first pregnancy in 1949 ended in miscarriage, and 2 more followed the same devastating pattern. By 1951, we'd stopped trying for children and thrown ourselves into work instead. Maybe we could adopt, John suggested after the 3rd loss. Maybe. I agreed, though part of me wondered if this was God's way of ensuring the Reynolds curse died with me. That's when John heard about opportunities in western Kansas small towns that needed skilled workers' places where we could buy land cheap and start fresh. "It'll be different there," he promised as we loaded our belongings. "Clean air, good neighbors, a chance to build something real." I wanted to believe him, but as we drove toward my birthplace, I felt like I was driving toward my destiny rather than away from it. We settled in Cedar Falls, a farming community of 300 souls about 40 miles from where I'd been born. John found work at the grain elevator, and we rented a small farmhouse on the edge of town. To my surprise, I adapted to rural life more easily than I'd expected. The pace was slower, the people were kind, and after years of city noise, I found peace in the sound of wind through wheat fields. In 1952, I finally carried a pregnancy to term. Sarah Elizabeth Hartley was born on a cold February morning, healthy and loud, and perfect in every way. Holding her for the first time, I felt love so fierce it terrified me. "She's beautiful," John whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "She's everything," I replied, already planning how to protect this precious life from the darkness that had shaped mine. But 3 years later, in 1955, that darkness would finally catch up with me. I was sorting through water-damaged belongings in our basement when I found my mother's tin box contents scattered by spring flooding. As I gathered the familiar items, I discovered documents I'd somehow missed as a child, or perhaps they'd been hidden beneath false bottom that the water had loosened. The first was a birth certificate for Thomas James Reynolds, born in Amarillo, Texas, 1923. According to the date, he was my half-brother, 7 years older. But it was the police report attached to the birth certificate that made my blood run cold. Thomas Reynolds wasn't just dangerous, he was a documented killer. The report, dated 1943, detailed his suspected involvement in the deaths of at least 12 women across 3 states. All victims were connected to James Reynolds Sr. through romance, blackmail, or family relationships. The suspect uses extreme violence to extract information and payments from victims before killing them, the report stated. Considered highly dangerous and psychologically unstable. Approach with extreme caution. My hands shook as I read the clinical descriptions of what Thomas had done to those women. Burns, broken bones, prolonged torture, designed to extract not just money, but information about other potential victims. But it was my mother's diary that provided the missing piece of the puzzle entries I hadn't found during my first desperate reading as a teenager. March 1942. Thomas returned today with specific questions about money James might have hidden. He believes James accumulated a substantial amount from his schemes and thinks I know where it's buried. When I insisted James never gave me anything, he became violent. broke my wrist, and threatened to do worse to Maggie if I don't cooperate. April 1942. Learned the truth about James's business from Thomas himself. They weren't just running romance schemes, they were operating a sophisticated blackmail network. James would seduce vulnerable women, document their affairs, then demand ongoing payments for silence. Thomas collected these payments and eliminated anyone who tried to resist. They've been doing this for over 20 years. May 1942. Thomas knows about Maggie's parentage now. He's seen her, studied her face, and the resemblance to James is unmistakable. He wants to know what inheritance James might have left her. When I told him she's just a child, he laughed, said children grow up, and when she does, she'll owe the Reynolds family whatever her father should have provided. The final entry was written the day before my mother's death. I won't live to see what happens to Maggie, but I pray she's strong enough to survive it. Thomas Reynolds isn't just collecting debts, he's settling scores that go back decades. He believes every child James fathered owes him compensation for the work he did, protecting their father's secrets. Maggie will be hunted not for what she's done, but for what she represents, the living proof of James Reynolds's crimes. I sat in our quiet farmhouse, my daughter sleeping peacefully upstairs, finally understanding the full scope of what threatened our family. Thomas Reynolds had been hunting me for 13 years, systematically tracking down his father's victims and their children. And now at 25, with a husband and child to protect, I'd made myself an easier target than ever. The past hadn't released me when I fled to Kansas City, or when I married John, or when I changed my name. It had simply been patient, waiting for me to build something precious enough to use as leverage. Within weeks, I would discover just how patient and how close Thomas Reynolds had been all along. The first sign of trouble came from Mrs. Patterson, our nearest neighbor, who stopped by with fresh eggs and disturbing news. "Strangest thing," she said, settling into our kitchen for coffee. "Man came by yesterday asking questions about the folks who used to live in your place. Wanted to know if any young women lived there, specifically anyone who might have been connected to traveling salesmen back in the 1920s. My blood turned to ice. "What did you tell him?" "Truth, that the Millers lived there before you folks, and before them, it was old Mrs. Kendricks until she died. But he seemed real interested in the area, like he was planning to stick around." "What did he look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Tall fellow, kind of thin. Had a nasty scar on his face right along here." She traced a line from her ear to her mouth. "Polite enough, but something about his eyes reminded me of a snake watching a mouse hole." After she left, I sat at my kitchen table with shaking hands, staring at my sleeping daughter, and realizing that 13 years of running had finally come to an end. Thomas Reynolds had found me, had been asking questions about my exact location, and was probably planning his approach, even as I sat there, trying not to panic. I wanted to tell John everything, but how could I explain that my family's criminal legacy was about to destroy the life we'd built? How could I burden him with knowledge that would only make him another target? Instead, I began preparing for what I knew was coming. I loaded John's shotgun and kept it beside the kitchen door. I practiced walking through our house in complete darkness, memorizing the location of every possible weapon. I taught myself to sleep lightly, waking at the smallest sound. "You seem nervous lately," John observed one evening as I jumped at a car backfiring outside. "Just tired," I lied. "Sarah's been fussy." "Maybe you should see Doc Patterson. Get something to help you rest." But no medicine could quiet the voice in my head that whispered about buried secrets and approaching violence. I was living on borrowed time, and every day that passed without incident only meant Thomas was getting closer to making his move. The confrontation came on a bitter December night when John was in Topeka bidding on a construction contract. I'd put Sarah to bed early and was mending clothes by lamplight when the electricity suddenly went out. I told myself it was just winter weather affecting the power lines, but every instinct I developed during my violent childhood screamed danger. I grabbed the shotgun and moved carefully toward the back of the house, listening for sounds that didn't belong. That's when I heard footsteps on our back porch, slow, deliberate, someone testing the door handle with practiced stealth. I crept closer to the window and peered through the curtain, A tall, thin man stood on our porch, his scarred face clearly visible in the moonlight. Thomas Reynolds had finally come calling, and he wasn't making any attempt at subtlety. "Mrs. Hartley." His voice was cultured, almost gentle. "I know you're in there. I just want to talk about some family business. Won't take but a few minutes of your time." I didn't answer, but he seemed to take my silence as invitation to continue. "I've been looking for you for a long time, Margaret. Ever since I learned about your parentage. See, your daddy left some unfinished business when he died, debts that need settling. As his daughter, that responsibility falls to you now." The casualness of his voice made my skin crawl. He was talking about murder and extortion, like they were overdue bills approaching violence with the calm professionalism of an accountant. "I know you're scared," he continued, "but there's no need for that. I'm a reasonable man. We can work something out that benefits everyone involved." But I'd read the police reports. I knew what working something out meant in Thomas Reynolds's vocabulary. The women who'd tried to negotiate with him had ended up tortured, killed, and buried in shallow graves across 3 states. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding, trying to decide whether to run or fight. Running meant leaving Sarah alone in her crib, unthinkable. Fighting meant facing a man who'd spent 2 decades perfecting techniques of violence I couldn't imagine. The choice was made for me when I heard the back door splinter. Thomas Reynolds stepped into my kitchen, like he owned it, his scarred face calm and confident. He looked around appreciatively, taking in the homey details John and I had worked so hard to create. "Nice place," he said conversationally. "Cozy. Good for raising a family." His eyes found the stairs leading to Sarah's room. "Speaking of family, I understand congratulations are in order. A daughter, isn't she about 3 years old now?" The implied threat was unmistakable. He knew about Sarah, had probably been watching us for weeks, learning our routines and vulnerabilities. "What do you want?" I asked, the shotgun steady in my hands. "What I've always wanted," he replied, seemingly unconcerned about the weapon pointed at him. "What's owed to the Reynolds family for 23 years of faithful service to your father's business interests." And then he explained exactly what that meant, and I understood that everything I'd feared about this moment had been nothing compared to the reality of what Thomas Reynolds had planned for me and my family. "See, your daddy was a smart man," Thomas said, settling into John's chair like he'd been invited for dinner. "Smarter than most people gave him credit for. He didn't just seduce lonely women, he documented everything. Photographs, letters, detailed records of every affair. Built himself quite a little business blackmailing them afterward." I kept the shotgun trained on him, but he seemed completely unconcerned, like having a weapon pointed at him was just part of normal conversation. "My job was collection," he continued. "James would send me to gather the monthly payments from his women. Most paid up quiet, like wanted to avoid scandal. But some got stubborn, thought they could just stop paying and disappear." "What happened to them?" I asked, though I already knew. "What do you think happened?" His smile was cold as winter wind. "Can't have word getting around that the Reynolds family doesn't collect what's owed. Bad for business." He pulled out a small notebook and flipped through pages covered with names, addresses, and dates. Some entries were crossed out in red ink. "Your mother's name is in here," he said, showing me a page. "Sarah Holbrook, later Sarah Morrison, owed us $300 in back payments when she died. Interest and penalties bring that to about $800 now." "She never paid because she never had any money," I protested. "We were dirt poor." "I know exactly how poor you were," Thomas interrupted. "Spent plenty of time watching your little farm, waiting for the right moment to collect. But then she up and died before I could have a proper conversation with her." He closed the notebook and looked at me with calculating eyes. "Which brings us to you, Margaret. As James's daughter, you inherit both his assets and his debts. Lucky for you, I'm feeling generous tonight." "Generous how?" "Well, normally I'd expect full payment plus 20 years of accumulated interest. But I understand you're a young mother just starting out, so I'm willing to make alternative arrangements." The way he said alternative arrangements made my stomach clench with revulsion. "What kind of arrangements?" I whispered. "The kind your mother should have made 20 years ago," he replied, standing up slowly. "The kind that ensure your daughter grows up with a mother who understands the value of family loyalty." He moved toward me with predatory grace, and I raised the shotgun to my shoulder. "Stay back," I warned. "I'll shoot you." "No, you won't," he said confidently. "Because if you kill me, there are others who know about you. Others who'll come looking for what's owed. But if you cooperate, if you're reasonable about settling this debt, maybe we can work out an arrangement that protects everyone involved." But I'd read enough about Thomas Reynolds to know he never left witnesses alive. Whether I cooperated or not, Sarah and I were loose ends that needed eliminating. The only question was whether he'd torture us first to extract information about other potential targets. Think about your daughter," he continued, still approaching. "Think about what happens to her if you make the wrong choice here." That's when I pulled the trigger. The shotgun boomed in the confined space, but Thomas dove sideways at the last second. Most of the pellets tore through empty air, though I saw him stagger as a few found their mark. Bitch!" He snarled, no longer the calm professional. Blood seeped through his coat sleeve, and his face was twisted with rage. "Should have done this the easy way." He lunged forward faster than I could reload. We crashed to the kitchen floor, struggling for control of the weapon. He was stronger, but I was fighting for my daughter's life, which gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. The shotgun clattered away as we rolled across the linoleum, him trying to pin my arms, while I clawed at his eyes. I managed to drive my knee into his groin, and he doubled over with a grunt of pain. "Going to make you pay for that," he gasped, pulling a knife from his boot. "Going to make you beg before I end this." But as he raised the blade, my hand found the handle of the cast-iron skillet John had left on the stove. I swung it with every ounce of desperate strength I could muster. The impact sent Thomas sprawling against the kitchen wall, blood streaming from a gash in his scalp. But he wasn't finished. With animal tenacity, he pushed himself upright and staggered toward me again. This time, I was ready. As he lunged with the knife, I sidestepped and grabbed the butcher knife from the wooden block on the counter. 25 years of surviving violent men had taught me exactly where to aim. The blade slid between his ribs like it belonged there, finding his heart with surgical precision. Thomas Reynolds looked down at the knife handle protruding from his chest with something approaching surprise. "Well," he said softly, blood frothing from his mouth. "Guess you got more of your daddy in you than I thought." Then he collapsed on my kitchen floor, his blood pooling around Sarah's scattered toys. I stood over his body, shaking with adrenaline and shock, listening to the sudden silence that followed violence. Upstairs, Sarah began crying. The noise had finally woken her, and her voice broke the spell that held me frozen. Thomas Reynolds was dead. I'd killed him with my own hands to protect my family. And now I had to decide what to do with the body of a man whose disappearance might bring even more dangerous people to my door. The choice I made in those next few minutes would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it was also the choice that ensured my daughter would grow up safe from the Reynolds family's legacy of violence. I stood in my kitchen staring at Thomas Reynolds' body, while my daughter's cries echoed from upstairs. Every instinct screamed at me to call the sheriff to report what had happened as self-defense. But the notebook Thomas had shown me lay open beside his corpse, filled with names and addresses that proved this wasn't an isolated incident. If I called the authorities, they'd want to know who Thomas was and why he'd come for me. The whole story would emerge: my father's criminal enterprise, my mother's blackmail payments, the systematic violence that had followed the Reynolds family across multiple states. In a community like Cedar Falls, that kind of scandal would mark Sarah for life. But more importantly, Thomas had mentioned others who know about you. If his criminal network learned he'd been killed while trying to collect a debt, they might send someone else to finish what he'd started. I made a decision that still haunts my dreams 48 years later. Instead of calling for help, I decided to handle the problem myself. First, I went upstairs to comfort Sarah, who'd been terrified by the noise, but was otherwise unharmed. I rocked her back to sleep, whispering lullabies, while my mind raced through the practical steps of hiding a murder. Loading Thomas's body into John's truck nearly broke my back, but desperation gave me strength beyond my normal capabilities. I wrapped him in a tarp from the barn, then drove him to our back 40 acres where the creek ran deepest. The December ground was frozen solid, but I found a spot where spring floods had left the soil softer. It took me 6 hours to dig a grave deep enough to hide him permanently, working by moonlight while winter wind cut through my clothes. By dawn, Thomas Reynolds was buried 6 feet underground, covered with rocks, to prevent animals from digging him up. I'd scrubbed the blood from my kitchen floor with lye soap until my hands were raw, burned his notebook in our wood stove, and hidden his personal effects where no one would ever find them. When John returned from Topeka 3 days later, excited about the contract he'd won, I acted like nothing had changed. But something fundamental had shifted inside me that night. I'd crossed a line I never thought I'd approach, and the woman who'd buried Thomas Reynolds was someone I barely recognized. "You look tired," John observed, settling into the same chair, where Thomas had calmly explained his plans for my family. "Sarah's been fussy," I lied. "Teething, I think." He accepted the explanation, but I could see him studying my face, noting changes I couldn't hide entirely. The woman he'd married had been capable of violence when necessary, but she'd never actually killed anyone. Now she had, and the knowledge showed in ways I couldn't control. The immediate aftermath was the hardest part. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every stranger in town might be another Reynolds family member come to settle scores. I developed habits that seemed normal, but were actually survival strategies: checking locks, obsessively keeping knives within reach, watching the horizon for signs of trouble. "Mama's scared," Sarah said one morning, her 3-year-old vocabulary inadequate for what she sensed in my behavior. "Mama's just careful, sweetheart," I replied, but she was right. I was scared not of external threats anymore, but of what I'd discovered about my own capacity for violence. The months passed without incident. No one came looking for Thomas Reynolds. No mysterious strangers asked questions about missing persons. Gradually, I began to believe I'd successfully eliminated the threat to my family without creating new ones, but the secret changed me in ways that affected every relationship. I flinched when John touched me unexpectedly, afraid he might somehow sense what I'd done with these hands. I had nightmares about digging graves and washing blood from kitchen floors. Most devastating of all, I began to see potential violence in every interaction, wondering if other people were capable of the same ruthlessness I'd displayed. "You're different," John said one evening as we sat on our porch watching Sarah play in the yard. "Since I came back from Topeka, you've been harder somehow." "People change," I replied, unable to meet his eyes. "Not like this. Sometimes I look at you and see a stranger." He was closer to the truth than he realized. The woman who'd killed Thomas Reynolds was a stranger, someone who'd emerged from darkness when my family was threatened. She lived inside me now, like a caged animal, and I never knew when she might be needed again. But life, I discovered, has a way of moving forward even after terrible secrets. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who brought joy to our daily routine. John's business thrived, providing the security we'd always dreamed of. On the surface, we looked like any other young family building their future in small-town Kansas. Only I knew how much blood had been spilled to protect that illusion, and how much I'd sacrificed of my own innocence to ensure my daughter's safety. 23 years passed before the past returned to haunt me. In 1978, spring flooding washed out much of central Kansas, including the creek that ran through our old property. A highway construction crew working on erosion control discovered human remains, bones, scraps of cloth, and a corroded pistol that had somehow survived decades underground. Sheriff Morrison came to our house on a Tuesday evening, asking polite questions about anyone who might have gone missing during our time living on that property. Bones could have been there for decades, he said, settling into our living room. But we found this with them? He showed me the rusted pistol. Coroner estimates the burial happened sometime in the 1950s. I kept my face carefully neutral, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. Can't think of anyone who went missing during that time. Plenty of drifters passed through, but none that stayed long enough to matter. Mrs. Patterson mentioned you had some trouble with a stranger asking questions back in '55. Fellow with a scarred face. You remember anything about that? Vaguely, I lied. He came by once asking about previous residents. Seemed harmless enough. Sheriff Morrison made notes, but I could see he wasn't particularly interested in pursuing a case with no witnesses, no missing person report, and no clear evidence of foul play. Rural areas were full of unmarked graves, victims of accidents, disease, or simple violence that had been handled privately by families who couldn't afford official investigations. After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen and wondered if this was how secrets finally surfaced, not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow erosion of time and weather that exposed what had been carefully buried. John died in 1987 peacefully in his sleep after 42 years of marriage. At his funeral, I stood beside his grave and silently thanked him for accepting me without demanding complete truth, for loving me despite the shadows I'd carried into our relationship. Sarah and James, we'd finally had a son in 1960, both built successful lives, raised families of their own, became the kind of people who made the world better rather than worse. They never learned about their grandfather's criminal activities or their mother's capacity for violence, and I intended to take those secrets to my own grave. But life, I've learned, rarely allows us to control how our stories end. 3 months ago, I received a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about that night in 1955. It came from a woman named Patricia Reynolds Hoffman, who identified herself as my half-sister, another daughter of James Reynolds Sr., born to a different woman he'd seduced and abandoned. I've been researching our father's criminal enterprise for 25 years, she wrote, documenting the scope of violence and corruption that marked his business dealings. I believe you encountered our half-brother Thomas, and I believe you may have been his final victim. Her letter included photocopies of police reports, court documents, and FBI files that revealed the true extent of the Reynolds family's criminal activities. James and Thomas hadn't been operating alone. They'd been part of a network that included dozens of associates across multiple states, all specializing in blackmail, extortion, and murder. Thomas killed at least 18 women between 1941 and 1955. Patricia's letter continued. All wives, daughters, or girlfriends of our father's victims. The pattern stopped abruptly in December 1955, leading investigators to assume he'd died or been imprisoned under false identity. But I think something else happened. I think he finally encountered someone strong enough to fight back. She was right, of course. I wrote back confirming her suspicions and sharing details I'd never told anyone else. For the first time in 68 years, I spoke complete truth to someone who could understand its full context. Patricia's response arrived 2 weeks later, along with official documents that vindicated everything I'd done that December night. Based on evidence I've provided to law enforcement agencies in 3 states, she wrote, the FBI has officially closed the Thomas Reynolds case. He's listed as killed in self-defense by an unnamed victim during an attempted sexual assault and murder. No charges will ever be filed because his death prevented dozens of other murders he was planning to commit. But the real surprise came in Patricia's final letter delivered just last week. She'd used her research to track down information about our father's final years following James Reynolds Sr. through prison records and court documents. Our father died in Colorado State Prison in 1963. She wrote, serving time for fraud and extortion. According to the chaplain's records, he spent his final years writing letters to women he'd wronged, trying to make amends for the violence his business had enabled. One letter was addressed to Sarah Morrison in Dodge City, Kansas, It was returned as undeliverable, but I thought you should see what he wrote. The letter she enclosed was yellowed with age, but still readable. Dear Sarah, I know I have no right to contact you after what I did, abandoning you when you needed me most. I've spent 20 years in prison thinking about the women I hurt and the children I left behind to face consequences of my actions. I know Thomas came looking for you and our daughter. I know what he did to the others, and I pray every night that you were strong enough to survive him. If Margaret is reading this, I want her to know that whatever darkness she might have inherited from me, she also carries your light, Sarah. I want her to know that sometimes the most moral choice a person can make is to survive, no matter what it costs. I was a coward who let other people pay for my crimes. But if my daughter had to face Thomas Reynolds, I hope she found the courage I never had to fight back against the violence I helped create. I hope she's alive and safe and free from the legacy of pain I left behind. James Reynolds, 1962. Reading those words, I finally understood the true meaning of what had happened that December night in 1955. I hadn't just killed a predator in self-defense, I'd ended a generational cycle of violence that had consumed dozens of innocent lives. The woman who'd buried Thomas Reynolds in the frozen ground had been doing exactly what my father had hoped, surviving, protecting her family, and refusing to let evil have the final word. I'm 83 years old now, and I can tell this story without shame or regret. I killed Thomas Reynolds because he threatened my daughter, buried his body, because I chose protection over scandal, and kept the secret because some truths serve the greater good. The woman who fought him that night wasn't a monster. She was a mother defending her child, a survivor, who refused to become another victim in a pattern of violence that had lasted too long. She did what needed doing, then disappeared back into the ordinary life of loving her family and serving her community. This is my legacy, not the violence I was capable of when cornered, but the love I chose to build despite it. Not the Reynolds family curse, but its ending. Not the darkness I inherited, but the light I passed on to children who never had to know what their mother was willing to do to keep them safe. The storm that began in my childhood finally ended when Thomas Reynolds died on my kitchen floor. I'm the one still standing when the winds die down, and after 48 years of carrying this secret that feels like victory enough for any life.